Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Let's look at a hardened warrior stepping onto a battlefield in the mid-11th century. Take someone like Merleswine the Sheriff, a man who, oversaw executions and fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066.
Right.
If you rely on that really enduring myth of the early medieval period, you're probably picturing him trudging through the mud in this drab, colorless burlap, maybe wearing a crude pelt.
Yeah, that's the classic Dark Age stereotype.
But the historical sources and the archaeological evidence paint a radically different picture. If you actually encountered Merleswine, you'd be looking at a man dressed basically like a peacock.
Oh, absolutely.
He'd be wearing a tunic banded with brilliant gold embroidery, a cloak dyed in intense blue, and garments with depictions of, wildcats and elephants on them. So today we are taking a deep dive into the true history of Anglo-Saxon dress, covering the mid-5th century through the 11th century as part of our History of Clothing series.
And it's an important deep dive because that stereotype is incredibly persistent, mainly because, the organic materials of this era, the wools and linens, they decay in the soil.
Right, they just rot away.
Exactly. But when you synthesize textile analysis, the grave goods, and contemporary art, you uncover a society where clothing was actually a highly sophisticated technology. These garments were the primary medium for signifying status, cultural identity, and, shifting religious allegiances.
So we are going to guide you through exactly how that technology functioned. We'll look at the chemistry of their dyes, the distinct construction of women's and men's wardrobes, the engineering behind the heavy metal jewelry, and the physical reality of their footwear.
And eventually we'll trace how the simple act of weaving completely restructured the economy of early England.
Right. But to understand any of that, we have to start with the raw fibers. I mean, what exactly are you wearing if you are living in 5th century England?
Well, the foundation of your wardrobe would be heavily reliant on the agricultural cycle around you. We're primarily talking about wool from sheep and linen derived from flax.
And these weren't materials you could just purchase on a whim. Processing them took an enormous amount of labor, right?
Oh, massive amounts. Linen, for instance, it requires pulling the flax plants by the roots, rotting the stalks in water, a process called retting, and then beating and scraping the fibers until they're soft enough to spin.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. But it creates a lightweight, breathable fabric that's relatively soft against the skin, which is why it was the standard for undergarments.
And then you have the wool for the outer layers. Which brings us to the visual impact of these clothes, because the sources make a crucial distinction between these two fibers when it comes to color.
Yeah, they do.
Linen is notoriously difficult to dye. The cellulose structure just doesn't hold natural pigments well, so it was almost always left its natural grayish-brown color, or laid out in the sun to bleach white.
Right, but wool is entirely different. Wool is a protein fiber. When it's properly cleaned and degreased, it has this massive affinity for taking and holding dye.
And this is where the mud and burlap myth completely falls apart.
Completely. Experimental archaeology shows us they had access to incredibly vibrant colors derived right from the landscape. They harvested woad for blues, weld, or a plant called greenweed for intense yellows, madder roots for reds, and certain types of lichen to achieve purples.
Let's look at woad specifically, because the chemistry involved here is quite something. To get that deep, brilliant blue, you can't just boil the plant and throw the wool in, right?
No, not at all. It requires a fermentation vat. The sources detail the mechanics of this, and it's a complex reduction process. The dye in the woad leaves has to be made soluble, which means removing oxygen from the liquid.
Which was often achieved by creating an alkaline environment using a rather pungent ingredient, stale urine.
Yes, stale urine. You'd heat the vat and let it ferment. Inside that vat, the dye compound becomes soluble, but, and here's the catch, it is completely colorless in the liquid. If you look into a woad vat, the liquid just appears sort of yellowish green.
This is the moment that must have seemed like outright magic in an early medieval village. You take a bolt of white, woven wool, you submerge it in this yellowish, terrible-smelling vat, and you let it soak.
Right.
And when the dyer pulls that dripping wet wool out of the vat, it's still yellowish. But the moment the oxygen in the air hits it, a chemical reaction occurs. It oxidizes instantly.
Yeah, it's like watching something develop right in front of your eyes. In a matter of seconds, that yellow fabric transforms into a brilliant, vivid blue.
And to achieve the really dark, rich shades, They wouldn't just leave it in the vat for hours, would they?
No, they use multiple short dips. You pull the wool out, let it oxidize and turn blue, and then dip it back in. This builds up the color evenly without, stripping away the dye that's already adhered to the fiber.
It's a high-level chemical process. But getting the color onto the wool is only half the battle. For many dyes, particularly the reds and yellows, you need a fixative to ensure the color doesn't just wash out the first time it rains.
Exactly. You need a mordant. The mordant acts as a chemical bridge. It binds to the fiber on one side and binds to the dye molecule on the other.
And for centuries, the standard, most effective mordant was alum, right? Potassium aluminum sulfate.
Yes, but the problem for early Anglo-Saxon dyers was that mineral alum had to be imported, largely from the Mediterranean. And in the 5th and 6th centuries, those trade routes were heavily fractured. It made alum an incredibly rare and restricted commodity.
So they had to find a local workaround. And the native flora provides an alternative in the form of club moss.
Right, certain species of club moss are biological accumulators of aluminum. They pull it up from the soil and store it in their leaves.
The native British species, Lycopodium selago, it works, but the sources say it's highly inefficient.
Very inefficient. Extracting the aluminum requires keeping a mixture of the moss and water heated to exactly 40 degrees Celsius for several days. It's a massive drain on firewood and labor.
But the archaeological record from later Viking Age York, spanning the 9th to 11th centuries, shows a sudden shift. Excavators found remnants of completely different species of club moss, Diphasium complanatum.
And that species doesn't grow natively in Britain. It grows in Scandinavia and continental Europe.
Which gives us a direct physical footprint of international trade driven entirely by the fashion industry. Scandinavian settlers and traders brought their own superior mordanting plants across the North Sea because the demand for high-quality, color-fast clothing was just that strong.
Yeah, you can literally trace the movement of human populations by looking at the specific weeds they imported to process their textiles.
I do wonder about the practicality of wearing these brilliant blues and reds in a rural setting, though. We are talking about an environment with plenty of mud, smoke, and rain. A modern person throws their clothes in the wash after a day or two. If a farmer or a lord is out riding, getting dirty, how do they maintain these colors?
Well,
Doesn't heavy laundering wash out natural dyes and strip away the natural lanolin that makes the wool weatherproof?
see, that is a very modern concern. Their solution was incredibly simple. They just didn't wash their outer garment.
Wait, really? They just didn't wash them?
No. When textile archaeologists examine the surviving fragments of dyed wool from graves, they look for felting. Felting occurs when wool fibers mat together due to heat, friction, and moisture, which are the exact conditions of rigorous washing. And the vast majority of these outer textiles show zero evidence of felting.
So they're just walking around in dirty clothes?
Not dirty, just not submerged in water. They would let mud dry and brush it off with a stiff bristle brush. They'd spot clean stains. But doing a full immersion wash of a dyed outer tunic or cloak was highly uncommon. By avoiding water, they preserved the vivid pigments and the natural, water-resistant lanolin of the sheep's fleece.
Which explains the reliance on linen for the undergarments. The linen tunic sits directly against the skin. It absorbs all the body's oils, the sweat, the grime.
Exactly.
And because it's undyed cellulose, you can boil it, scrub it with lye soap, and lay it in the sun to bleach without worrying about ruining an expensive blue dye job.
The layered approach is what made the wardrobe functional. The linen takes the biological toll, and the wool serves as the social display. And, how they chose to display that wool changed dramatically over the centuries. This is highly visible when you examine the women's wardrobe from the 5th century onward.
Let's trace that evolution then. In the early period, from the 5th to the early 7th century, the standard female silhouette is defined by a garment commonly referred to as the peplos. This is worn over that long-sleeved linen underdress we just discussed. The peplos is essentially a massive tube of woven fabric.
And the dimensions of this garment highlight how much labor went into clothing a single person. Based on where the fastening brooches sit on the skeletons in excavated graves, and the folds of the textile preserved beneath them, we know these garments were enormous.
How enormous are we talking?
Reconstructions point to a single tube of fabric that could be 54 to 66 inches in height and between 94 and 106 inches in circumference.
That is nearly 9 feet of fabric wrapping around the body.
Yeah, it's massive. The mechanics of wearing it are quite clever, though. The woman steps into the tube, pulls the top edge up to her armpits, and then brings the fabric over her shoulders, front and back, pinning it together on each collarbone with a heavy metal brooch.
The outer wool layer leaves her arms entirely bare, but her arms are covered by the fitted sleeves of the linen underdress beneath. And then, to manage all that excess volume, she cinches it at the waist with a belt or a girdle.
And that girdle is a focal point of early Anglo-Saxon female identity. It wasn't merely a structural belt to hold the fabric in place. It was a wearable toolkit and a highly visible indicator of her status and responsibilities within the community.
If you look at the grave goods found resting at the hips of these women, they are carrying an incredible array of items suspended from their belts on metal chains or leather straps. They carried keys.
Right.
In this society, controlling access to the household stores, the grain bins, and the strong boxes was the ultimate sign of domestic authority. The keys were a literal manifestation of her power.
They also carried personal grooming tools. We find small iron and bronze nail scissors, tweezers, and tiny spoon-like implements known as ear scoops used for removing earwax.
Which really counters the narrative of a filthy, unkempt society. They cared deeply about personal hygiene and carried the tools to maintain it at all times.
Definitely. But the excavations reveal items that go beyond just the practical. At sites like Chesildown on the Isle of Wight, the graves contain items suspended from the girdle that lean into the mystical.
Like what?
Well, archaeologists have found small, perfectly polished crystal balls. They've found large, decorative, spoon-like sieves. These don't have an obvious mundane household function.
The crystal spheres and perforated spoons suggest a role tied to foresight, healing, or perhaps the filtering of liquids for medicinal or ritual purposes. A woman wearing these items was signaling that her authority extended beyond the pantry and into the spiritual or medical well-being of her community.
Exactly. She was a figure of significant social weight.
Looking at the sheer mechanics of the peplos, it strikes me as an incredibly adaptable piece of engineering. It's essentially one size fits all. If a woman's body changes over time, if she gains weight, loses weight, or becomes pregnant, she doesn't have to throw the garment away or retailor it.
Right, she just alters where she pins the brooches on her shoulders or adjusts the tension of the girdle. It's highly functional.
Yet, despite its brilliance, the sources note that by the late 7th century, the peplos completely vanishes from the archaeological record.
Yeah, the disappearance of the peplos is a prime example of how fashion is dictated by ideology. In the late 7th century, England is undergoing a massive cultural shift. Christianity is cementing its hold, and there's increasing political and economic contact with the Frankish Empire across the Channel.
And the Franks viewed the shoulder-clasped peplos as archaic and overtly pagan.
Exactly. So the pressure to assimilate to continental norms alters the physical shape of their clothing. They abandon the adjustable tube of fabric and adopt long, tailored tunics that slip over the head.
These new gowns were ankle-length, layered, and often featured a keyhole neckline that could be closed with a single small brooch at the throat.
And the wide, draping sleeves of the peplos are replaced by tailored sleeves that often flared extravagantly at the cuff. The emphasis shifted entirely. Instead of displaying wealth through heavy paired metal brooches and a loaded girdle, the wealth was woven directly into the fabric itself.
This is where we see the rise of intense surface decoration. As we move toward the 10th and 11th centuries, the sources describe these women's gowns becoming canvases for intricate textile art. They utilized tablet-woven bands of contrasting colors at the cuffs and hems. But the most significant development was the embroidery.
This era births the tradition of opus Anglicanum, or English work. This was needlework of such staggering quality, utilizing imported silk threads and genuine gold wrapped around silk cores, that it became an international luxury export.
Even the elites in Rome, including the Pope, specifically requested vestments and garments embroidered by English women.
Right. The sheer labor involved in embroidering a hem with gold thread is staggering. You were carefully couching the gold wire down onto the wool, securing it with tiny stitches of silk so it catches the light.
So the woman's body was no longer adorned with heavy metal tools. She was encased in a soft, tailored armor of silk and gold. It's a total transformation of the female silhouette, heavily documented because of these shifting religious and trade networks.
But when we try to trace a similar evolution in the men's wardrobe, we hit a significant evidentiary wall. The archaeology of male dress is far more challenging to interpret.
And that challenge comes down to how they bury their dead, right?
Yes, exactly. In the early cemeteries, a wealthy woman was buried with her heavy bronze or silver shoulder brooches. The metal in those brooches corrodes in the soil, and the corrosion products seep into the fabric caught beneath the pin.
Preserving a tiny fossilized stamp of the textile.
Right. But men were not buried with massive paired brooches. Men were buried with their weapons. You find graves containing spears, woody shields with iron bosses, and large single-edged knives called caexes.
Because they used organic materials like leather or hidden bone toggles to fasten their clothes, rather than large metal clasps, there is no metal resting directly against the structural seams of their garments to preserve the cloth.
So we have to reconstruct their outfits using entirely different methodologies.
We rely on the visual record. We look at illuminated manuscripts, like the Old English Hexateuch, and stone carvings, such as the Gosforth Cross in Cumbria. And when you cross-reference these images with the tiny textile fragments we do have, a very specific male uniform emerges.
Men of all classes wore a knee-length tunic, known as a circle. They wore trousers, and they wore cloaks.
The construction of the surtle is interesting. It was typically cut very full in the skirt, often with added triangular panels called gores inserted into the side. Seems to give it a flared shape.
And they'd wear a leather belt, but instead of wearing it visibly on the outside, they would often pouch the excess fabric of the tunic over the belt, hiding it entirely and creating a voluminous silhouette around the midsection.
The most distinctive feature, though, is the sleeves. In manuscript after manuscript, you see men depicted with sleeves that look incredibly strange to the modern eye. They're bunched up and intensely wrinkled from the elbow down to the wrist.
Those wrinkled sleeves are a deliberate design choice and a subtle form of conspicuous consumption. The sleeves were tailored tightly, but cut extremely long, often extending well past the fingertips. When the man put the tunic on, he would manually push the excess fabric back up over his forearm.
Why design a sleeve that gets in your way only to push it back?
Because excess fabric equals wealth. Fabric was highly labor-intensive. By having sleeves that were a foot longer than necessary, you were signaling that you could afford to waste valuable dyed wool purely for the aesthetic effect of the wrinkles.
Right. It's the same logic behind a modern tailored suit with non-functional buttons on the cuff. It shows a bespoke level of tailoring.
Exactly. Now, on their lower half, they wore trousers, which is a garment with deep roots in Northern Europe.
The Roman poet Ovid complained about the trousered Germanic tribes centuries earlier. Anglo-Saxons had two distinct styles. You have loose trousers that bunch at the waist and hang in heavy folds, providing a lot of airflow and mobility, and then you have the narrow fitted trousers.
And with the narrow trousers, they utilized additional leg garments for protection against the brush and the cold. This could take the form of leather or cloth stockings. But the most iconic method is cross-gartering.
Cross-gartering is a very specific physical sensation. You take long, narrow strips of woven cloth and you wind them tightly around your lower leg, starting from the ankle and crisscrossing up to the knee, securing them with a leather lace or a small hook.
It acts like a modern compression sock. It supports the calf muscles during a long day of walking or riding, and it prevents the trouser fabric from snagging on thorns or underbrush.
Above the tunic and trousers, the outermost layer of defense against the British weather was the cloak. In the early centuries, the textual evidence and comparative archaeology point to the widespread use of short, fur-lined cloaks.
But the way they wore these fur cloaks is completely counterintuitive to how we see them in modern movies. You do not wear the fur on the outside to show it off.
Right, exactly the opposite. You wear the skin side, facing outward to the elements, where the leather can shed the rain.
And the fur faces inward, brushing directly against your tunic or your skin. That traps a layer of dead air and uses your own body heat to keep you warm. It functions exactly like modern synthetic insulation.
As the centuries progress, those fur cloaks give way to large rectangular cloaks woven from heavy wool. But what remains consistent is how they fastened them. Whether it was the 5th century or the 11th, a man typically pinned his cloak on his right shoulder.
And this is a choice driven entirely by the physical realities of their society. It's an intensely martial society. By pinning the heavy bulk of the cloak on your right shoulder, the fabric drapes across your chest and covers your left arm, which is holding the shield.
But your right arm, your sword arm, remains completely free of heavy, restrictive folds. You have full mobility to draw a weapon or swing an axe at a moment's notice.
That functional design highlights a broader truth about the men's wardrobe. The basic combination, the surtle, the trousers, the cloak pinned on the right, remained essentially static for 600 years.
While the women's wardrobe underwent a total transformation from the peplous to the tailored Frankish gown, the men's silhouette barely shifted. Why did the male uniform resist change for so long?
It comes down to how the different genders were expected to communicate their social position. For a man, function was paramount. The tunic and trousers offered the perfect balance of mobility for riding a horse, working a plow, or fighting in a shield wall. But, just because the shape didn't change doesn't mean they weren't displaying status.
They just channeled their wealth into different avenues.
Precisely. A high-status male signaled his power through the sheer quality of the wool, the intensity of the dye, the presence of imported silk trims, and most importantly, the craftsmanship of his weapons. His sword hilt might be inlaid with gold and garnets.
While women, operating within a different social framework, used the entire silhouette of their dress to signal their household's wealth and their alignment with the shifting cultural and religious winds of the continent.
Exactly. But regardless of whether you're looking at the static male tunic or the evolving female gowns, the garments themselves are only the canvas.
The focal point, the ultimate billboard for personal identity, was the metalwork that held it all together. Before the widespread adoption of buttons in the later medieval period, the primary fastening mechanism was the brooch.
And brooches were highly engineered pieces of equipment. Let's return to the 5th and 6th centuries, the era of the women's peplos. The paired shoulder brooches used to clasp those gowns were large, heavy, and covered in intricate iconography.
A perfect example is the great square-headed brooch from Mildenhall in Suffolk, which dates to roughly 525 to 550. If you hold this object, you immediately realize it is not a delicate piece of jewelry. It's a substantial slab of cast copper alloy.
It's a heavy piece of hardware resting directly on the collarbone. The construction on the reverse side features a robust double-lug hinge that secures a thick iron spring coil and the pin itself.
But the front is where the cultural messaging happens. The Mildenhall brooch is heavily decorated. The foot of the brooch features two downturned beaked heads flanking a central bar, with the borders filled with meticulously punched circular stamps.
And originally, the corners and the side lobes were covered with applied silver plates. It created a brilliant, contrasting flash of silver against the golden color of the polished copper.
The specific combination of motifs on that brooch, the beaked heads, the geometric stamps, represents a fusion of local Kentish styles and influences coming across the North Sea from Denmark. It's a physical manifestation of a society blending different regional identities in mid-6th century East Anglia.
But just as the peplos vanished under the pressure of new ideologies, the reign of these massive paired shoulder brooches comes to a sudden end. As we cross into the 7th century, the entire geometry of how people fasten their clothes changes.
This shift tracks perfectly with the consolidation of Christianity. The Frankish-style gowns do not require paired shoulder clasps. Instead, the focal point moves to the center of the chest, at the throat. Women begin wearing a single, highly ornate disc brooch.
And the iconography on the metalwork shifts. The abstract, intertwined animal art of the pagan period is slowly replaced. We start seeing tiny, distinct crosses incorporated into the designs of shoulder clasps and belt buckles. The jewelry becomes a billboard for the new faith.
By the 8th century, the dominant fastener becomes the lozenge brooch. This is a diamond-shaped or kite-shaped strip of metal, officially classified by archaeologists as Weech Type 31.
Yes, Weech Type 31.
Why is tracking the shape of a simple metal pin so important to understanding the history?
Because the 8th century is a difficult period to study. The historical texts are sparse, and the burial practices change, yielding fewer grave goods. But the lozenge brooch appears everywhere across England. Its widespread, uniform adoption helps archaeologists map a massive political shift.
It's the era where the dozens of fractured, localized tribes are consolidating into larger, better organized proto-states like Mercia and Wessex.
Exactly. The adoption of a shared fashion, the lozenge brooch, signifies that people are adopting a shared, broader cultural identity. They're no longer just identifying as members of a small, local valley tribe. They are participating in a wider national aesthetic.
And later, in the 9th and 10th centuries, you see massive circular designs like the Strickland brooch or the Fuller brooch. Some of these circular brooches feature concave-sided geometric motifs inside them, which looks almost as if they're visually harmonizing the older pointed lozenge shape within the newer circular trend.
Yeah, the visual language evolves.
I am trying to visualize the physics of wearing one of these later circular brooches, though. Some of them are the size of a saucer, made of thick silver or copper alloy. They have a heavy iron pin on the back. You are using that pin to hold together the thick folds of a wool cloak or a dense linen gown. If you're walking, riding a horse, or just shifting your weight, that heavy metal pin is going to pull against the fabric. Wouldn't it just tear a hole straight through the weave of the garment?
Well, if you drove a heavy iron pin through a standard piece of woven wool, yes, the daily friction would eventually shred the fabric. The Anglo-Saxons knew this, and they engineered a specific textile solution to distribute the weight. They used a technique called tablet weaving.
Tablet weaving is entirely different from using a large loom. You use small, square cards made of wood or bone with holes punched in the corners. You thread the warp yarn through these holes. By turning the cards in your hands, you twist the threads around each other, creating a narrow, incredibly dense, strong band of fabric.
And they would use this tablet weaving technique to finish the borders of their high-status cloaks and gowns. It provided a reinforced edge that wouldn't fray. But the genius part is the integration with the jewelry.
How so?
While turning the tablets, the weaver would occasionally pull out a small loop of the weft thread, creating tiny reinforced eyelets protruding directly from the edge of the woven band.
Oh, I see. So when the wearer puts on the cloak, they don't stab the brooch pin through the main body of the fabric. They pass the pin through these integrated reinforced loops.
Exactly. The loops take all the structural strain. The weight of the silver is distributed evenly along the tablet-woven border, protecting the delicate, expensive broadcloth of the main garment. It's a brilliant piece of foresight, integrating the textile manufacturing process directly with the engineering of the metalwork.
We've spent a lot of time looking at the upper body. The bright woad blues, the tablet-woven borders, the massive silver brooches. But if you look down to the ground, the reality of their daily lives becomes much starker. The footwear of this period tells a story of physical endurance and technological leaps.
Yeah, if we start in the early period, the 5th and 6th centuries, the most common footwear for the majority of the population was likely nothing at all.
When you look at later illustrated manuscripts, the agricultural laborers, the men sowing seeds, guiding the ox plows, harvesting the grain, they are frequently depicted working barefoot.
Right. In a society where leather was a valuable commodity requiring extensive tanning and processing, you just don't waste it on the feet of a common laborer working in the mud, at least not during the warmer months.
When footwear was worn in the early period, typically by the wealthy or during the winter, it was rudimentary. The standard was a simple, one-piece enclosed leather shoe. The shoemaker would take a single piece of rawhide or lightly tanned cow or deer hide, wrap it around the foot, and sew or lace it together at the heel and over the toes.
It's essentially a leather bag for the foot. We have surviving examples of this style from the famous Sutton Hoo ship burial dating to the early 7th century.
It provides a layer of protection against cuts, but it's not waterproof, and the seams are exposed directly to the ground, which means they wear out quickly.
But as we move toward the 10th and 11th centuries, there's a total revolution in shoemaking technology. The industry shifts to a construction method known as the turn shoe. This completely re-engineers how footwear functions.
Instead of wrapping a single piece of leather, the shoemaker cuts a distinct, heavy leather sole and a thinner, more flexible leather upper.
And the assembly process is what gives it the name. They place the smooth outer sides of the leather facing each other and stitch the shoe together completely inside out. Once the sewing is finished, they soak the leather in water to make it soft and pliable, and then they physically muscle the shoe right side out, turning it.
The engineering benefit of the turn shoe is that all the structural seams and the linen thread used to stitch it together end up on the inside of the shoe.
Right, so the thread is no longer scraping against the cobblestones, the mud, or the sharp rocks. It significantly extends the lifespan of the footwear and makes it far more watertight.
And to make it even more waterproof, they introduced a component called the rand.
The rand is a thin, narrow strip of leather that the shoemaker sandwiches between the sole and the upper while stitching them together inside out. When the shoe is turned, that strip acts exactly like a rubber gasket in a modern pipe. It swells slightly when wet, sealing the seam tightly and preventing water from wicking up into the shoe.
Because of the anaerobic waterlogged soil in later urban centers like York, London, and Winchester, archaeologists have excavated massive quantities of these turn shoes, allowing us to see the exact styles they wore.
The finds from York and Winchester show a high degree of craftsmanship and fashion. We find flat, black leather shoes featuring a distinct white decorative stripe stitched straight down the center of the upper from the ankle to the toe.
This physical evidence perfectly corroborates the footwear depicted on high-status men in late Anglo-Saxon illuminated manuscripts. We also find ankle-high boots designed for better support. To fasten them, the shoemaker would cut a series of short, parallel slits into the upper leather near the ankle. A narrow leather thong would be threaded in and out through these slits, acting as a lace to cinch the boot tight.
The technical skill is remarkable. They utilized flesh-edge seams, where the shoemaker's needle enters the edge of the thick sole leather and exits through the flesh side, only piercing halfway through the thickness of the sole.
This ensures the bottom of the shoe remains entirely smooth, with no holes passing all the way through for water to enter. In places like Durham, we even find shoes reinforced with crescent-shaped heel stiffeners to maintain the shape of the boot.
The craftsmanship is undeniable.
But I always try to imagine the physical reality of walking in these shoes every day. It's just a flat piece of leather stitched to another piece of leather. There is absolutely no arch support, no steel shank, no thick rubber shock absorption. When you examine the skeletal remains from the cemeteries or the wear patterns on the surviving shoes, what does it tell you about the toll this took on their bodies?
The surviving leather soles tell a story of intense, repetitive friction. You see severe, localized wear patterns on the heel and the ball of the foot, indicating exactly how the individual struck the ground. And the osteological evidence from the graves confirms the impact of this.
You can see the damage in the bones.
You see significant adaptation, but also degradation. The bones of the feet are often very robustly developed, indicating muscles and ligaments that were highly adapted to balancing on uneven, natural ground without the artificial rigid support of a modern shoe.
However, this lifelong physical labor, combined with the lack of cushioning, led to high rates of joint stress.
Yeah, you see a prevalence of osteoarthritis in the foot joints and the knees. They frequently suffered from bunions and bone spurs. The turn shoe kept their feet dry and protected them from lacerations, but it offered zero structural relief.
The sheer volume of these highly engineered shoes found in places like York points to something much larger than just footwear. The presence of specialized shoemakers, alongside massive amounts of processed leather and textile remnants, indicates that the entire structure of society was changing.
Right, the production of the clothes on their backs and the shoes on their feet was being pulled out of the rural domestic sphere and centralized into the city.
Which brings us to the most significant economic shift of the era, the weaving revolution. To understand how radical this change was, we have to look at how cloth was made in the 5th and 6th centuries.
In that early period, textile production was a deeply domestic activity, and it was entirely female-led. A woman wove the clothes for her family inside her own dwelling. The technology they used was the warp-weighted, upright wooden loom.
We know this because the wooden frame of the loom rots away, but the mechanism relies on gravity. Archaeologists excavating early Anglo-Saxon sunken featured buildings frequently find rows of fired clay donuts lying in the dirt. These are the loom weights.
The loom itself leaned against the wall of the hut. The vertical threads, the warp hung down from a top beam, and they were tied to these heavy clay weights at the bottom to keep them under tension. The woman would stand in front of the loom, passing the horizontal weft threads back and forth.
To pack the threads tightly together and create a dense fabric, she used a bone tool called a double-ended pin beater. It's shaped like a cigar, pointed at both ends, allowing her to push individual threads upward against gravity.
It was an incredibly slow, painstaking process, but it was versatile. The warp-weighted loom allowed them to weave complex geometric patterns, like the four-shed diamond twills that were highly prized in the early period. It required immense skill, but it was decentralized. Every household produced its own cloth.
But as society evolved between the 7th and 9th centuries, the landscape changed. The small, fractured tribal settlements gave way to large, consolidated estates owned by kings, bishops, or powerful ealdormen.
And on these large estates, we start seeing the centralization of labor. Excavations at high-status rural sites like Flixborough reveal large concentrations of textile manufacturing tools. Weaving is no longer just a woman making a tunic for her husband. It's becoming an organized industry producing surplus cloth for the estate owner.
And then, in the late 9th century, a technological leap occurs that changes the archaeological signature entirely. A new type of loom appears in the emerging urban centers, the trading towns known as wicks. This is the two-beam vertical loom.
The evidence for this shift is absolute. The heavy clay loom weights completely disappear from the urban archaeological record. The double-ended bone pin beaters vanish.
Instead, in late 9th century towns like Thetford, excavators find single-ended pin beaters. They're blunt on one end and pointed on the other. This specific tool is the hallmark of the two-beam vertical loom.
Because this new loom secures the vertical warp threads between a solid wooden beam at the top and another solid beam at the bottom, you no longer need the clay weights to create tension. You just crank the beams.
It changes the way they weave. They transition away from the complex four-shed diamond twills and begin mass-producing simpler three-shed twills. They also change the yarn itself. They start using a combination of yarn spun clockwise Z-spun for the warp and yarn spun counterclockwise S-spun for the weft.
And the spin direction of the yarn matters because of the finishing process. When you take the woven cloth off the loom, it's relatively loose. To make it thick, warm, and weatherproof, you have to full it.
Which involves soaking the cloth in water, often with stale urine to act as a detergent, and physically pounding it or trampling it with your feet.
Yeah, that forces the wool fibers to mat together and shrink. By using yarns spun in opposing directions, the fibers catch and lock together much faster during the fulling process. It's an industrial optimization designed to save time and labor.
And that drive for optimization culminates in the 10th and 11th centuries with the arrival of a machine that shatters the old social order, the horizontal treadle loom.
The horizontal loom operates on a completely different physical axis. The weaver no longer stands, they sit at a bench. The warp threads are stretched horizontally in front of them, but the revolutionary component is the foot pedals, the treadles.
On the old upright looms, a woman had to manually lift the heavy bars, holding the warp threads by hand, pass the shuttle through, and then beat the cloth upward. It was exhausting on the arms and shoulders.
With the treadle loom, the weaver uses their feet to press pedals that automatically lift and lower the alternating threads.
By freeing up the hands to merely pass the shuttle back and forth, the speed of production skyrockets. Once the loom is warped, which is still a highly time-consuming process, a weaver on a horizontal treadle loom can produce a yard of cloth up to 6 times faster than a woman standing at an upright, warp-weighted loom.
But this incredible speed comes with a massive spatial cost. You can't tuck a horizontal treadle loom into the corner of a one-room, smoky domestic hut. It is a large, heavy, permanent piece of machinery. It requires a dedicated floor space.
It requires a workshop. And because it requires a permanent workshop located in an urban center with access to trade rights and raw materials, the social dynamics of clothing production fracture entirely.
This is where we see a fundamental gender shift. For 500 years, weaving was the domain of women. But when the historical texts from the 11th century discuss the operation of these massive new horizontal looms, they reveal something unprecedented.
The texts specifically describe men weaving with their feet. The operation of the treadle loom in the urban workshops was taken over by men.
Right.
What happened to the women?
Women remained the spinners. The new looms devoured yarn at an astonishing rate, but spinning couldn't be mechanized yet. It still relied on a woman drafting fiber onto a drop spindle by hand.
So it took roughly 8 to 10 spinners working constantly just to supply enough yarn to keep one treadle loom operating.
Exactly. So spinning remained a ubiquitous, poorly paid task performed by women in rural environments, while the men took over the prestigious, high-volume act of weaving in the city.
This sounds exactly like the birth of an industrial system. You have rural workers supplying raw materials to a centralized, mechanized urban hub, and it creates a managerial class. The individual weaver no longer owns the sheep or the wool.
No, a merchant or an estate financier controls the raw fleeces, pays the rural women a piece rate to spin it, and then pays the urban men to weave it. It is the foundation of the put-out system. The craftsperson loses control over the raw materials and the profits of the finished product. The merchant controls the supply chain.
If the horizontal loom allowed them to produce cloth 6 times faster, does that mean the average Anglo-Saxon peasant suddenly had a wardrobe full of clothes? Did this technological leap democratize fashion?
Not at all. The evidence shows that the average commoner still possessed only 1 or 2 main garments, which were worn daily and heavily patched or recycled. The massive surplus of cloth generated by the treadle looms was not meant for domestic charity, it was meant for export.
It fueled the economy.
It laid the groundwork for the medieval English wool trade, which would become the primary engine of the national economy for centuries. They exported finished broadcloth and raw fleeces across the Channel to the continent.
And the immense wealth generated by this efficiency flowed upward. It concentrated in the hands of the merchants, the high-ranking clergy, and the royal houses. It funded the imported silks, the gold opus Anglicanum embroidery, and the ostentatious peacock-like displays of men like Merleswine the Sheriff.
The technology advanced rapidly, but it widened the social stratification rather than closing it.
Which brings us full circle to a complete understanding of the Anglo-Saxon wardrobe. We have journeyed from the mid-5th century all the way to the eve of the Norman conquest in the 11th. We started in the smoke of the domestic hut, where women wove brilliant woad-dyed blue wool on warp-weighted looms, shaping it into massive, tubular peplous gowns pinned with heavy, culturally symbolic square-headed brooches.
We saw the men wrapped in fur-lined cloaks, utilizing the excess fabric of wrinkled sleeves to subtly broadcast their wealth while maintaining the static, functional silhouette required for a martial society.
We tracked the ideological shift of the 7th century, where the pressure of the Frankish Empire and the spread of Christianity replaced the peplos with tailored embroidered gowns and shifted jewelry from paired pagan shoulder clasps to single cross-adorned disc brooches.
We examine the physical reality of their lives through their footwear, watching the evolution from barefoot laborers and simple leather pouches to the highly engineered watertight turn shoes mass-produced in the urban centers of York and Winchester.
And finally, we witnessed the weaving revolution, where the invention of the horizontal treadle loom pulled cloth production out of the home, placed it into the hands of men in urban workshops, and birthed the export economy that defined medieval England. It's incredible how the fabric draped over a person's shoulders serves as a literal roadmap for tracking massive historical, economic, and religious shifts.
It really is.
But before we finish, I want you to consider a final thought. Throughout this deep dive, we've discussed how the organic materials of the Anglo-Saxon world, the brilliant blue wools, the soft linens, the complex tablet-woven borders, the leather turn shoes inevitably rotted away in the damp soil. They vanished, leaving behind only the metal bones of their outfits, the heavy copper brooches, the iron pins, the silver strap ends. It is from those isolated metal fragments that archaeologists have to reverse engineer their entire reality, their trade networks, and their values. Think about the clothes sitting in your closet right now. If your wardrobe was buried in the earth for 1,000 years, the organic cottons, the silks, and the merino wools would decay and vanish just the same. But the synthetic elements, the polyester blends, the plastic zippers, the nylon activewear, the acrylic logos, the rubber soles of your sneakers, those would survive perfectly intact. When the archaeologists of the year 3000 dig us up, what will our indestructible plastic brooches tell them about our social status, our globalized supply chains, and what we truly valued? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.